Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today we are talking about a science fiction game, the Panoceania sourcebook for the Infinity RPG. Infinity is a space opera cyberpunk with a really fantastic minis game and a connected but otherwise unrelated RPG set in the same universe. I talk about this RPG all the time. I really love it, and this is one of the faction source books. Panoceania, full disclosure, is for me the least interesting of the factions, mostly because they're kind of the default good guy faction, and that doesn't interest me. But this book makes a really good case for why they're still interesting and cool and fun. So we are going to look into this, and it's going to be great. Hooray for Panoceania. So let's take a look at the book itself. Most of the book, the vast bulk of this book, is in fact focused on the worlds. Pano, as a faction, controls three planets, three new planets, and they've got pretty solid hold on some of the old ones as well. So, the inside front cover is the map, where it talks about, of Neoterra. And then that's what we get. Chapter 2 is all about, 2, 3, and 4. Those are the three planets that Pano controls. And, I want you to look at this. Chapter 2, Acontecimento, which isn't even the main planet that they control, has a solid 15 pages of material. It is really in-depth, really detailed stuff. Acontecimento is like the breadbasket, not just of Pano, but of the entire human sphere. They have incredible resources, not just for mining, but for farming, for ranching. Anyone who eats food or wears leather or, any of this stuff throughout the human sphere, a lot of that food comes from Acontecimento. So it's kind of a big economic powerhouse in that sense. Neoterra, down here, that one is the capital city, so to speak. Certainly the most important, most populated world in all of the human sphere. It's kind of like the Coruscant of the human sphere. It's not an entire, city, planet-wide city in the same way, but it is the New York City, it is the London, it is the Tokyo, it is the Mexico City, the great big city that everybody goes to. The image that's behind me right now is an image of Neoterra. Varuna is the least populated planet, but for me the most fascinating one. It is mostly water. There are little islands and archipelagos that are there, but what's really interesting about Varuna is that most of the infrastructure, most of the cities and buildings and stuff are in or under the water, and there's actually an entire sentient alien species that lives there called the Helots, and we will look at the Helots later on. They are kind of like, Abe Sapien, Shape of Water, fish men and women, and you can have them as player characters, and they're really interesting. So we'll get into them later. So anyway, those are the three main planets. And let's take a look at this just to really hammer home how detailed this is. So it talks about climates and geography, pages and pages just talking about the plants and animals that live there. What is the economy like? What is the culture like? And you think, okay, what else could they possibly say about this? We've spent 5 or 6 pages already talking about all this stuff. And there's 10 pages left. And it's because they get into each continent and each major city. So much information about all of this stuff. And, what do you do there? And what is it like to live there? And why would it be interesting to go there? What kind of missions could you have as an RPG character in any of these continents or cities or areas? And so just page after page of all of this really detailed setting information, far more setting information than any single game master could possibly use. but every game master is definitely going to find something that they really like in this book. So let's have a look at chapter 6 now. Yay for all the setting information. Let's move on to the player information, because this is what is most exciting to me. Infinity uses a life path character creation system, and so most of what this setting information does is it adds new options to each of those steps, or as they call them, decisions. So, decision 1 is birth host. What kind of body do you have? And, if you are playing the Nomad faction, then you've got all the kind of uplifted animals and genetically engineered things that they have access to. If you're playing in the Ariadne faction, you might be human, or you might be a dogface or an antipode or something like that. If you are playing Pano, your option is human, or you can be a Helot. So, hooray, they add that. Then we get to Decision 3, Expanded Homelands, and they've got a whole new chart of, which planet you come from, which region on that planet you come from, what languages you would then speak. Really cool stuff. I love the level of crunchy detail that Infinity adds to everything here. New regions to be from different things. Decision 4, status. Every character includes status, and most of these status tables are the same. From hyper elite, you come from the 1% of the 1%, all the way down to a demogrant, which basically means that you are living on, the state draw. But what Pano adds is the ATEC. They have an entire kind of Luddite movement. Some of them are willfully ATEC, meaning anti-technology, and some of them just can't afford it or don't have access to it. And so, ironically, in the most developed, most high-tech, allegedly good guy faction of the entire setting, there are a vast group of people who don't have access to any of the high technology that the rest of the human sphere takes for granted. And so ATEC is now an option. Someone who doesn't have, the computers built into their brains, someone who can't see the patinas of the Maya net all around them. It's an interesting character option. And then they've got new tables, new adolescent tables, new careers with new career event tables, all kinds of stuff. And then, of course, all of these new careers. This is kind of sort of like a character class, except because of the life path system, an Infinity character can have multiple careers. So these are all really interesting stuff, and hooray for those. And there's a lot of them, and they're really interesting. And we don't have to look at every single one of them because I want to look at Helots. So, the Helots live in Varuna, and Varuna, like I said, is mostly underwater, and these are fish people. And they've got a really interesting culture, and this doesn't get too super detailed about them, but as you can see, there's still a lot of information. They call themselves the Ohm, rather than Helots. That's the kind of offensive word that humans use for them. The most interesting thing about the Helots for me is what is called pressure personality. That the Helot species, their personality, their attitudes, and their emotions change based on how much pressure they are currently under. So if you go into deep pressure, if you're diving down deep in the water, then the pressure increases and they become a little more laid back and maybe even a little more lethargic. If they are all the way on dry land, so they don't have any water pressure on them at all, that actually makes them very jumpy and it makes them very agitated. And then, of course, you've got what's called Sisulu pressure. Sisulu is their kind of, that's their word for where they live in the Sisulu waters. And that's where they kind of are at their most even keel as characters. So anyway, it's a really slick way of making them feel more alien and giving them, incentives to return to the water or to try to do things in the water rather than just be the fish guy who's always on land and it doesn't matter. So that's a neat thing that I liked a lot. Hooray for that. And talks about more about their culture and all these other things. There's a big section about them, including the Libertos, which is like the freedom fighter, the resistance faction of the Helots, who do not like the fact that humans have shown up and taken their planet and are using them, as indentured labor. Let's look last of all at Chapter 8. The militarily speaking, the key to Pano's power is what's called the Knightly Orders. And there are a bunch of, they look like, they style themselves to look like ancient knights. And I like this a lot. Oh, wait, I'm looking in the wrong section. These are basically just all the NPCs. And there's a ton of NPCs, and that's fantastic, and I'm not going to complain about that by any stretch of the imagination. But what I am going to do is look, I think it's here in the careers section where it talks about the Knightly Orders. There it is. So if you are a knight, you get all these attribute bonuses and you get access to these skills, and then the first time you take a knight as a career, you also are going to choose or roll a military order. Are you a Hospitaller, or are you a Dominican? Are you a Teutonic Knight? All these different things, and that is going to flavor you differently. So, and you can see this, this is kind of this armored knight that's evocative of medieval armor, and they wear swords, and they, in addition to the guns that they have. Anyway, if we go back to the cover of the book, this is, I believe, a Hospitaller, and you can see the very distinct kind of cathedral-like architecture and the medieval style to their high-tech armor. So that's kind of what Pano is about. Anyway, this is a good book. Pano is not my favorite faction, but like I said in the beginning, this book makes a good case for them being a lot more interesting than I give them credit for. They are not the one-sided, boring good guy faction at all. And in fact, if you read through a lot of this setting information, there's a lot of kind of troubling fascism in their culture, and the way they treat the Helots and the way they treat the Atex is not great. And so there is definitely a lot of conflict and a lot of tension inside of Pano. Anyway, it's a good book, and especially if you are a Pano fan. I've got a friend who absolutely adores them. They're his very favorite faction in the setting. So, don't take my lack of enthusiasm as a bash on them. I'm a Nomads player through and through. Pano is not Nomads, but they're awesome. And they're still really interesting and really cool. So, check out the book. Check out the game, Infinity RPG. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Dan Wells, and you are awesome.